among the thousands of brittle ledgers sleeping in county archives, there is one thin book from Hancock County, Georgia, that no clerk likes to handle. On one yellowed page, dated March of 1851, a careful hand notes that the entire Wycliffe Plantation, 1,200 acres of cotton and pine, has passed into the ownership of a woman, described in the margin as the Abominable One, before that ink ever touched paper. Wycliffe stood as an orderly world of straight lines and predictable cruelty. The main house rose at the end of a quarter-mile oak drive, a Greek Revival structure whose white columns declared the Havard family's status long before visitors reached the wraparound porch. Behind it, the plantation unfolded in iron-straight rows of cotton, corn, and slave cabins, all tuned to the bell that rang at 4:30 every morning but Sunday. Thaddeus Hafford had inherited it in 1842, 63 enslaved people, a stack of ledgers, and debts sharp enough to ruin any man who missed. He was 31 then, a recent widower. His wife Catherine and their infant son lay beneath matching stones on a hill behind the house. Grief had hardened him into something precise and controlled. He recorded everything, every bolt of cloth, every pound of cotton, every birth and whipping in coffin, so the world could never surprise him again. In October 1849, the world still tried. The slave coffle arrived late in the afternoon. Wagons splashed with dried mud, chains clinking faintly when the oxen stopped before the side yard. Heavy autumn rains had swollen the Oconee and forced a detour. The trader, Augustus Webb, climbed down, cursing the road and praising his prime Virginia stock in almost the same breath. 17 people stepped or stumbled from the wagons. Men and women, a boy with eyes too old for his narrow face, a girl who kept looking over her shoulder as if someone had forgotten to come with them. They smelled of sweat and river water and the stale fear of people who had been driven over 200 miles by men with guns. The inspection took place away from the main house, as was customary. Thaddeus moved down the line with his ledger balanced in one hand, noting age, apparent health, any visible deformity that might reduce a body's usefulness. He did not trust traders. His father had taught him that a man who bought on another man's enthusiasm deserved his ruin. He almost missed her. She stood near the end of the line, body angled just slightly away from the others, head bowed as if the ground itself were worth studying. She was perhaps 5'6", solidly built, in a filthy brown dress, indistinguishable from the others. But something about the way she held herself, a tightness at the back of the neck, a deliberate control over each breath, made him pause. "That one's not for sale," Webb said quickly, seeing where his eye had gone. "Damaged goods. Just moving her on for her owner's sake." "Damaged how?" Thaddeus asked, without looking up from his page. Webb shifted, glanced at the 2 smaller planters who had ridden over from adjoining counties to see the stock. "You can look if you like, but I'm telling you now, nobody wants to work near her. I've had trouble since Richmond." "Show me," Thaddeus said. Webb strode to the woman, gripped her chin, and jerked her head up. She did not fight him, but her whole body went rigid, as if bracing for impact. With his free hand he yanked at the collar of her dress, dragging the fabric aside to bare her throat and upper chest. Thaddeus understood at once why. Webb had tried to steer him away. Her dark brown skin was broken by irregular patches of pale white, as stark as paint splashed onto stained wood. They spread across her neck, vanished beneath the dress, then reappeared along her forearms and the backs of her hands. The edges were sharp, as if drawn with a knife, brown to white, no gentle blur, just a jagged map that made the eye flinch. One of the other planters hissed under his breath and turned away. Webb released her and stepped back, wiping his hand on his coat as though he had touched wet lime. "You see," he said. "Abominable. Previous owner bought her at 12. Didn't notice until it started spreading. Kept her back of the house after that. Some say it's catching. I've never seen proof, but you know how people are. Fights, Talk of curses. I told him I'd haul her west if he covered the cost, but I'm not representing her as merchandise. What's her name? Thaddeus asked. Sarah. No surname I know of. She reads some. Keeps kitchen inventories, that sort of thing. Vitiligo, Thaddeus thought. His father had owned a medical text, its pages full of sketches of tumors and twisted bones and strange rashes. He remembered the word. The neat little paragraph beneath a drawing of white-patched skin. Not contagious, not fatal. No effect on strength or intellect. He also knew it did not matter what a physician in New York thought. In Georgia, appearance was fate. This woman's marks made her something people would fear over their own ignorance, which made her almost useless as a commodity. How much for the 3 men in front, he said, and the woman. Webb stared. You can have her for the trouble of a price. Augustus. They settled on $800 for the 3 men and $30 for Sarah, barely more than the cost of hauling her across state lines. Webb looked relieved to see her lead away toward the kitchen house, as if a troublesome ghost had departed his wagon that night. By lamplight in his study, Thaddeus recorded the transaction. Acquired, female, approx 23 years, literate, skin marked by depigmented patches causing disturbance among others but no apparent functional impairment. Assigned to kitchen house under supervision of depute. Cost, $30. Expected value, uncertain. He sanded the ink, closed the book, and never imagined that this single line, this cheap, ambiguous purchase would alter the fate of Wycliffe more thoroughly than drought, disease, or war. The transformation did not begin with thunder. It started with a storage room. The other kitchen workers refused to sleep near her. They crossed themselves when she passed, muttered charms under their breath. Even those who had seen whippings and births and burials without blinking could not look long at her skin. Delapute, the free woman who ruled the kitchen, had neither time nor patience for hysteria. She found an old storage closet attached to the kitchen house, cleared out a crate of broken platters and a barrel of mouse-chewed cornmeal, and turned it into a cell barely big enough for a straw mattress and a wooden box. You'll sleep here, she told Sarah. You'll work from sunup till we're done. You'll stay out of the master's sight unless I send for you. Understand? Yes, ma'am, Sarah said. Her voice was quiet, smooth. That was all. She moved with the same controlled care he had noticed in the side yard. No wasted motion, no nervous tics. She accepted the narrow mattress, the sideways looks, the silence that folded itself around her. If the isolation hurt, she gave no sign. It was Della who discovered the first thing that truly mattered. One morning, she left a newspaper on the kitchen table, folded open to the commodity prices, intending to copy numbers into her own book later. By evening, when she reached for it, she found Sarah already closing her eyes and reciting the figures aloud. Cotton, rice, tobacco, quoted from memory, alongside a senator's name and a line from a speech about tariffs. Who taught you to read like that? Della asked. Previous household? Sarah said. Mistress taught her daughters. I listened. Della looked at her sharply. Or read when nobody was watching. Sarah's gaze slid away. It doesn't matter now, she said. It did matter. By the end of the week, Della had tested her with receipts, inventory lists, the Bible, and a letter from Savannah. Sarah read them all with ease. Her numbers were faster than Della's, more accurate. She did in half an hour what had taken Della half the morning. Della waited until her weekly meeting with the master, as they reviewed flour and salt and candles in his study. She mentioned the new woman's skills with deliberate casualness. She keeps a better kitchen ledger than I do, Della said, and you know I don't admit that easy. Does she now? Thaddeus asked. He might have left it there, but profit was his compass, and efficiency, a siren song he could never quite ignore. Have her bring the books to me tomorrow afternoon, he said. I'll see for myself. The next day, rain hammered at the windows, while the house wrapped itself in the gray, muffled quiet of bad weather. Sarah stepped into the study for the first time, carrying 4 slim ledgers. She kept her eyes on the floor, set the books down with careful fingers that displayed the pale patches on her knuckles, and turned to go. "Wait," he said. "Explain this entry from November 3rd. Your figures don't match the previous system." "I changed how partial units are counted," she replied without lifting her head. "The old way rounded everything up or down. Small errors grow over a year. This method records eighths and quarters. The totals come out truer. Show me." She moved to the desk and, in neat pencil lines, laid out the old and new methods side by side. Within minutes, he saw it, the slow bleed of his previous system, the tiny dishonesties that had favored suppliers and confused year-end tallies. Her way was cleaner, ruthless in its way. She did not sound like an untrained house servant explaining a trick she had stumbled across. She spoke like someone who understood why numbers behaved as they did, who had examined not just sums, but methods. "Who taught you fractions?" he asked. She hesitated. "I learned them, sir." "From who?" "From books." She lifted her eyes then, just for a heartbeat. There was something blazing there, not defiance. Not quite, but a fierce intelligence pressed flat, like parchment held under a palm. "Does it change anything?" He thought of Georgia law, of the neighbors' righteous fury if they knew a literate slave lived in his kitchen house, with numbers working in her favor. He thought of the medical text with its page on vitiligo, and of how little comfort such knowledge offered in a town that saw disease in anything it did not understand. "No," he said at last, "it doesn't change that you're useful." He had meant to keep his distance. Instead, within weeks, she spent every afternoon in his study, copying correspondence, balancing accounts, arranging his father's disorderly library into an index he could actually use. The insult Abominable began to lose its power in his thoughts. The patches on her skin still startled him in unexpected moments, hand reaching for a pen, a throat exposed as she bent over a ledger, but over time his mind adjusted. The contrast stopped, shouting. The person beneath the pattern grew sharper. He did not know that she was measuring him, too, weighing patience against opportunity. She had learned in other houses what happened when a master's interest turned toward a woman who could not refuse him. She had also learned how rare it was for a man in his position to ask what she thought about anything that did not touch a pot or a broom. The danger lay in the combination. The drought crept in on quiet feet the following summer. First, the ground hardened, cracking beneath barefoot soles. Wells ran lower, the bucket ropes scraping more rock than water. Cotton leaves curled inward, like hands trying to hide. By July, the sun had become a hammer laid on the back of the land from morning till evening. Thaddeus responded as he responded to everything, with plans and lists and furious control. He ordered trenches cut from the creek at the northern boundary, threw money he did not have at new tools, shifted work hours to spare the field hands the worst hours of heat. He slept badly and coughed more than he admitted. Weeks of thin crops and worried nights carved hollows under his eyes. Sarah watched the transformation, ledger by ledger. She saw where credit was stretched, where a single bad harvest might send debt sliding out of his grip. She did not need him to say that his father had nearly lost the plantation in a similar year. She could read it between the lines of old books. She also saw opportunity. The afternoon work in the study had already shifted from copying to conversation. At first, they had talked only of cotton yields and freight costs. Then, when a letter arrived from his sister in Savannah, chiding him for failing to remarry, the subject began to lean toward more dangerous ground. "My sister believes a man without a wife is an incomplete object," he muttered one evening, dropping Margaret's letter on the desk. "She has a list of respectable women who would be delighted to take on my house and womb in the same transaction." "Why haven't you?" Sarah asked, pen still moving across the page. The question crossed a line, but he did not correct her. "My first marriage was a ledger entry," he said. "Land balanced against land, one family obligation exchanged for another. Catherine deserved better than that. I have no appetite for repeating it." "You don't want heirs?" she asked. "Someone to inherit these ledgers you guard more jealously than your own sleep. A son who would feel chained to this place as I did." He shook his head. "If the plantation survives, I will find a nephew or cousin to saddle with it. If it doesn't, my lack of heirs will be the least of anyone's worries." The talk might have ended there, but the drought pressed everyone thinner, and thin things tear. One evening, after a day of blistering heat and 3 sick hands carried to the infirmary, he stared at the map of his land pinned on the wall and said, without turning, "Do you ever think of what you would be if you were not what the law says you are?" "I think of it every day," she said quietly. "Then I fold the thought away, because it changes nothing." "What if it could?" he asked. She barely breathed. The room felt smaller. Outside, someone chopped wood in a measured rhythm that made his heart match it. "If it could," she said, "then someone would have to decide whether they were willing to lose everything they are for something they have never been allowed to imagine. Very few people are that brave, or that selfish." He did not answer. The words had come out of him without plan. He turned the conversation back to freight routes. It did not matter. The question was out now, circling both their minds like a vulture. When the fever came, it did not care about questions. It began in the East Field, a man collapsing with a burning forehead, a woman complaining of chills hours before she could no longer stand. By the end of the week, 4 lay on pallets, shivering in their own sweat in a storage barn hastily cleared for cots. The doctor from Sparta arrived with a leather bag and a look that said he disliked treating the enslaved but enjoyed taking planters' money. He prescribed quinine and cool cloths and prayers. In that order, the disease moved through the quarters like something with a map. Young men, old women, children. It spared some, killed others, with no logic any of them could see. Graves appeared on the hill behind the cabins, raw red earth in uneven rows. Thaddeus worked until his shirts stuck to his back. He kept lists of symptoms, cross-checked relapses against doses, argued with the doctor over whether a particular woman should be bled or left alone. He stood in the heat outside the infirmary and felt something cracking inside. That was not just fatigue. Sarah stepped into the breach without being asked. She reorganized the infirmary, separating the newly sick from those recovering. She assigned nursing shifts, wrote down who had been near whom, what they had eaten, which wells they used. She cleaned, boiled, scolded, soothed, copied the doctor's prescriptions in a steadier hand than his own. The same people who would not share a bed with her now let her lift their children, wipe their faces, lean close enough to watch their chests rise and fall. Death had shoved her condition into the background, whatever white patches they saw on her hands. They also saw those hands carrying water and medicine and small, burning bodies. When the fever finally reached the house, it chose the master. It began with a headache he ignored. By nightfall, he was shivering under blankets, teeth rattling so hard he could not stop them. By morning, his skin was on fire. His carefully ordered world dissolved in sweat and delirium. He dreamed, later, of Catherine's face bending above him, her hands cool on his hot skin, her voice saying his name the way she had when they first married, before duty and grief had worn everything smooth. In reality, it was Sarah who sat beside the bed, damp cloth in hand, counting his breaths. Sarah who measured his pulse, forced quinine between his teeth, and called the doctor when his ramblings grew too wild. The third night, he woke half-aware and reached for her, the way a drowning man reaches for whatever his mind believes is sure. He whispered a name that was not hers. He did not see the woman before him, only the ghost behind her. She could have pulled away. She should have. Every story she knew about girls in her position warned against exactly that moment. Instead, with the fever's heat between them and a decision months in the making heavy in her chest, she did not. Days later, the fever broke. He woke to sunlight and the sour smell of sickness baked into linen. His muscles ached as if he had fought someone in his sleep. "How many?" he croaked. 12 dead, Sarah said. 37 recovering. 7 still ill, but stable. Her voice came from the chair beside his bed. Her face hovered in the blur above him, more lines around her eyes than he remembered. "You could have gotten sick," he said, "taking care of me." "So could anyone who went into that barn," she replied. "Your illness did not make you special, only vulnerable. He faltered. Fragments of fevered nights slid just out of reach, but shame and confusion tangled in his throat. "Did I harm you?" "You were not in your right mind," she said. "You thought I was your wife?" He closed his eyes, nausea washing over him that had nothing to do with fever. "I should have stopped you," she went on. "I did not. I chose not to. That is on me, not on your sickness. When you are fully well, we will speak of it plainly. Not now. You need rest." He tried to argue. His body betrayed him and dragged him under. They waited 2 more weeks for the other shoe to fall. When it did, she did not soften it with preambles. "I'm with child," she told him in the study, standing where she always stood with the ledgers in her arms. 2 months, by my count. The world narrowed around those words. The desk, the window, the shelves of books went strangely distant. His own heartbeat sounded too loud. "How?" he began, then stopped, hearing the idiocy. "When?" "During the fever." Her voice was steady, but her fingers clenched the edge of the desk. "You remember pieces of it, enough to know what I am saying." He pressed his hand over his eyes. Every path his mind tried to take ended in a wall. "In law," she continued, because she had had time to rehearse this, and he had not. "A child follows the condition of the mother. If I remain a slave when I give birth, your child will be born, your property. You can free him or afterward. But the moment they enter this world, they belong to you as fully as that chair does. I will not treat my child as property," he said. Something hot and violent rose in him at the very thought. "I will not treat you as property. I don't care what Georgia's statute says. The law does not ask whether you care," she said quietly. "It only requires obedience or punishment. There is manumission, yes. You could free me. We could pretend that makes the rest simple. It would not. Your neighbors would call it madness. Your creditors would call in their loans. You would lose this plantation, your place, likely your safety, and our child would still walk between worlds where neither side admits him. Then, what do you propose?" he asked. "Because I cannot leave it as it is." She watched him for a long time. He could almost see the pages in her head flipping past. Laws, roots, stories overheard in kitchens and stables. She had been preparing this in silence while he recovered. "There are states," she said at last, "where the law does not explicitly forbid a marriage like ours. Where it is scandalous, yes, but not criminal. Pennsylvania, for one. Massachusetts, perhaps. If we travel there and marry under their law, our marriage would be, at the very least, arguable. The Constitution requires states to honor contracts made in other states. Marriage is a contract, isn't it, Mr. Hafford? You've researched this," he said. "I've read what I could reach without attracting notice." Her mouth tightened. "Most of what I found disagrees with itself. But there is space between the words, enough to walk through, if we're careful." He imagined it, leaving the land that had shaped him, standing in some cold northern building, saying words no law in Georgia recognized as valid, returning to neighbors who would not know whether to call him madman or traitor. "If we do this," he said slowly, "we lose what, or we fight to keep it until the fight kills us. We lose whatever remains of my standing. we lose your safety among your own people. Our child grows up as living proof of our defiance. Yes, there was no hesitation in her answer. Or we can do nothing. You can let me bear your child as your property. You can free us quietly and pretend that is kindness enough. You can spend the rest of your life writing orderly figures in your books, knowing they are balanced on a lie. He thought of Catherine, arranged for him like a horse. He thought of the fever and the barn full of burning bodies, and how helpless he had felt when the disease ignored his plans. He thought of Sarah's face at his bedside, the anger in her eyes when she spoke of what the law would turn their child into. I am tired of living inside lies, he said. Then choose another way, she replied. Come with me, he said. They left for Pennsylvania under the pretense of business to the overseers. He said he was going north to inspect new gins and bring back ideas for irrigation. To Della, he said Sarah would accompany him to manage correspondence and accounts during the journey. Della nodded once and did not ask questions, but when she packed Sarah's small bundle of clothes, she added an extra dress and a pair of stockings she had been saving, and laid her hand on the younger woman's arm for just a moment. Come back alive, she said. However you come back. The coach rattled north through November rain, wheels sucking at muddy ruts. At inns along the road, they took separate rooms. Two strangers. Sarah was an unusually educated servant with papers that attested she was traveling with her master's permission. To themselves, they were two people sitting awake in the thin-walled dark, listening to each other breathe through old wood and new fear. Pennsylvania smelled different in Georgia. The air always carried a trace of damp earth and something green rotting under the surface. In the small town outside Philadelphia where they finally stopped, the air smelled of coal, smoke, and snow. Men spoke faster. Women walked more quickly, slipping in and out of shops with heads high and eyes bored. The Quaker meeting house where they married was a plain building with bare floors, unadorned benches, and windows that made a frame of cold light on the wooden walls. The man who performed the ceremony wore simple clothes and never once looked away from both of them as he spoke. Do you enter this freely? He asked them, twice. Knowing the world you will go back to does not bless what we do here. Yes, Thaddeus said. Yes, Sarah said. Her dress was blue wool that made her skin look deeper, richer. The patches showed stark on her hands as she took his, when the moment came to sign the book. The Quaker slid the pen toward her without a flicker of hesitation. She wrote her name, Sarah Hafford. The ink lay on the page as solid as any law. They consummated the marriage in a Philadelphia hotel, on a bed that did not creak like the ones at Southern inns, and did not smell of other people. No fever, no ghosts, just two bodies finding each other cautiously, with the awkwardness of strangers and the tenderness of people who had already shared sleepless nights and mortal danger. In the morning, he watched her sleep, her cheek on his arm. For the first time the marks on her skin looked to him not like scars but like some map drawn in reverse. Pale where other people would be dark, a record of what she had survived. What are you thinking? She asked, without opening her eyes. That I have crossed a line I cannot uncross, he said, and that I do not regret it. Good, she murmured, and smiled. Going home was harder. News travels on legs and tongues, faster than any coach. By the time the White House on the hill came into view between the oaks, a quiet had settled over Wycliffe that did not belong there. It was a listening kind of silence, like the pause between a question and its answer. James Hawthorne met them on the porch, hat in his hands. Sir, he said. Ma'am. He stumbled on the second word, and then kept going. We need to speak. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of my wife. Thaddeus replied deliberately. Hawthorne's gaze flickered to Sarah, then away. Mr. Crenshaw has filed a petition with the county court, he said. He says, you're not fit to manage property, on account of your marriage. He's got other planters' signatures. Some officials, 2. On what grounds? Thaddeus asked. That you've entered an illegal union with a woman of African descent. That you've shown moral depravity. Hawthorne swallowed. They're also saying she's diseased. There's a warrant for her to be examined by a state doctor. Behind Hawthorne's words, Sarah could already hear the whispers that had brought them into being. Witchcraft, curses, unnatural influence. She could hear the satisfaction in Louisa Crenshaw's voice when she repeated them over tea. She could hear the careful way neighbors would avoid saying black, while meaning it with their whole bodies. Of course they would make it about health, she said softly. It's easier than admitting what troubles them most. What troubles them most, Thaddeus said, is that a contract they thought unbreakable has been broken in front of them. The months that followed felt like a siege. The doctor the state sent to examine Sarah was polite, clinical, and cruel in the way of men who believe facts absolve them of empathy. He peered at her skin, scraped samples, called in another man from Savannah to peer again. He pricked, prodded, pressed his thumb against pale patches as if force could rub out the difference. His report eventually declared that she posed no contagious risk. He could not resist adding that her condition was repugnant to the eye, and that allowing her to hold authority in a Christian household was against natural order. The petition against Thaddeus crept through the court like sickness through a body. Lawyers refused the case, unwilling to endanger their other clients. He finally found one Josiah Petone, who wore his hair too long and drank too much, but read law carefully and seemed animated by an unfashionable interest in principles. On paper, you should win, Petone told him. Pennsylvania recognized your marriage. The Constitution requires states to honor contracts made elsewhere, but judges are men before they are books. If they hate what you represent enough, they'll find a way to say the law doesn't apply. How do we stop them? Sarah asked. She sat in the corner of the study, hands folded over her growing belly. You make it harder for them to hate you, Petone said bluntly. Right now you're a story they've already decided. White man, black woman, witchcraft, lust, madness. If you want a chance, you have to stand in front of them as something else before the hearing ever begins. How? Thaddeus asked. Let them see you, Petone said to Sarah. Not the marks. You. Speak where they cannot help but listen. The notice ran in the Sparta Gazette 5 days before the hearing. Citizens of Hancock County of good conscience, it said, were invited to an open forum at the courthouse to hear directly from Thaddeus and Sarah Hafford about the nature of their marriage, the management of Wycliffe, and the responsibilities of property and person. On the appointed day, the courthouse filled long before they arrived. Men packed the benches below. Women stood in the back, fans fluttering like nervous birds. A knot of men stood near the door with their arms folded, faces set, led by Robert Crenshaw in a coat finer than he could currently afford. Thaddeus spoke first. In the measured cadence he used when explaining accounts, he described their journey north, the marriage certificate, the legal argument. When he finished, the room was quiet in the way that means nothing has changed. Then Sarah stepped forward. Her belly was too prominent now to hide. Her dress was plain, gray cotton. The light from the high windows fell across her face and hands, making the patches glow almost silver. My name is Sarah Hafford, she said. Her voice carried farther than Thaddeus's head. Some of you have heard other names from me. Abomination, witch, freak. Let me tell you who I am in my own words, just this once. She told them about vitiligo in simple terms. She did not cite medical texts. They would only mistrust those, but she spoke of skin and pigment, of how some cells stopped making color and others did not. She spoke of how other children had screamed when they first noticed her marks, how one mistress had made her eat in a corner so guests would not see her. I learned to read, she said, by listening at doors. I learned numbers by watching men who thought I was part of the furniture. I have used those things to make Wycliffe more profitable than it was when I arrived. I have used them to keep people alive who would otherwise be dead." She did not look at Robert Crenshaw when she said that, but many in the room did. Everyone knew his plantation's yield had lagged behind Wycliffe's for years. "I did not cast a spell on my husband," she went on. "I did not slip potions into his tea. I showed him my mind and he chose to value it. Some of you find that more frightening than any witchcraft, because if you admit it is possible, you have to look again at all the people you have kept at arm's length and called less than human." Someone snorted. Someone else murmured an agreement too softly to be named. "I am carrying his child," she said. "Under the law, that child will be born free because of the steps we took. We did not do this to mock you. We did it because we could not bear to watch another generation be born into chains we had the power to unlock. If you take this plantation from us, you will not be defending decency. You will be defending a system that requires you to pretend people like me are things." Her voice did not tremble. She finished, folded her hands, and stepped back. Silence stretched. The judge, watching from the side, looked down as if surprised by his own hands. Then, from the back, someone began to clap. It was a small sound in the large room. It grew and another joined, then another. Not a thunder of approval, but not nothing. Crenshaw surged to his feet, face flushed. "Listen to her," he snapped. "Silvertongue. Book words. That's exactly the danger. You let one of them talk like that, and next they'll be standing up here telling you your farms aren't yours at all, that your children owe them something." "What they owe," Thaddeus said, rising, "is the truth." The room dissolved into shouting voices, arguments, words like property and sin thrown like stones. The sheriff banged his stick until order was grudgingly restored. The next morning, the real hearing felt almost small in comparison. Judge Harrison Matthews sat at the bench, spectacles low on his nose. He listened to Petan argue the law, to Crenshaw's attorney argue public policy. He asked questions about whether marriage was a contract like any other, whether the Constitution meant what it said when it spoke of full faith and credit. He gave his answer a week later. The ruling was brief. The marriage, Matthews wrote, was valid where it was contracted and must therefore be recognized. The court could not deprive a man of his property because his personal choices offended his neighbor's morals. Wycliffe remained in Thaddeus's hands. The petition was denied. In the next paragraph, the judge made it plain that his personal conscience exempted him from any enthusiasm. "This court does not approve of such unions," he wrote, "nor does it seek to encourage them. Citizens retain every right to shun those whose conduct offends them. They had won the right to exist, not the right to belong." Wycliffe adjusted to its new reality, the way a bone knits after a bad break, slowly, imperfectly, with pain weather predictable in its healed places. Some changes were obvious. They began paying wages, small ones, at first to the enslaved workers who wanted them. Not enough to buy a ticket north, but enough to buy cloth, extra food, small luxuries, enough to start a whisper that things were different on that hill. Some changes were quieter. Manumission papers moved from theory to ink. A woman who had tended the dairy for 20 years found herself free, with a contract that guaranteed her a wage to keep doing what she had always done there if she chose. A man who had once tried to run and been dragged back with whip scars now walked into Sparta on a Saturday with a paper in his pocket that said no one could sell him again. The neighbors hated it. They muttered about chaos and bad influence. They told each other that allowing a free black woman to run accounts would make the field hands think they were equal to overseers. They warned their own servants that stepping onto Wycliffe land would taint them. What they did not say was that the numbers did not support their complaints. Year after year, Wycliffe's yield stayed steady or rose, even when weather and war rumors dragged others down. Drought and disease still came. No plantation was immune, but when disaster struck, Wycliffe had organized records, contingency plans, and workers with a reason to care whether the place survived. Then Daniel Tucker aimed a gun at his employer. It started with a reassignment. Samuel, a field hand, whose broad back and stubbornness made him valuable and troublesome in equal measure, refused to accept Tucker's order to move him from one row to another without the master's say-so. "Mr. Hafford promised me I'd work with my brother this season," he said. "You can't go against that." Tucker's temper had been simmering for months, fed by Snickers and Sparta, by being cut from hunting parties, by the sense that the ground of his world had shifted out from under him. He struck Samuel across the mouth with the back of his hand. When the other men stepped toward him, he drew his pistol. By the time Thaddeus and Hawthorne arrived, the air in the field was thin with fear. Samuel lay on the ground, lips split, blood bright against the dust. 6 men stood between him and Tucker. Tucker's arm shook just slightly as he swung the barrel between them. "Put the gun down," Thaddeus said. His voice carried no more force than usual, but every man in earshot heard it. "They won't obey," Tucker snarled. Sweat streaked the dust on his forehead. "They think they're free men now, thanks to your arrangements." They listened to her. He jerked his chin toward the house, though he could not see it through the trees. "You've lost control, sir." "Pointing a loaded weapon at my workers is not control," Thaddeus replied. "It's cowardice. Lower the gun. You're the coward." Tucker's voice cracked. "Too soft to do what needs doing. This is still Georgia." "There still finish that sentence," Thaddeus said softly, "and I will show you that I am not too soft to do what needs doing." Footsteps rustled behind him. Sarah arrived at his shoulder, breathing a little harder from the haste. She had left Thomas in Della's arms on the porch, with strict instructions not to let him follow. "Go back," Thaddeus said without turning. "Please." "No," she answered. "Whatever this is, it concerns me too." Tucker swung the pistol toward them. "There," he hissed. "Side by side. You can't even keep up the pretense, can you? You should have stayed in the kitchen." His eyes burned into Sarah. "You should have worn a scarf over that cursed skin and thanked God you had a roof. Instead, you put ideas in his head. You made him forget his kind." "What I did," Sarah said, "was refuse to be less than I am because it made you comfortable." "You're nothing," Tucker spat. "You're a mistake God meant to drown. The fact that you stand there like you're a lady doesn't change what you are." Samuel made a small sound, half groan, half warning. The other men held steady. "You are dismissed, Daniel," Thaddeus said. He spoke carefully, each word spaced like posts in a fence. "You will hand me that pistol. You will leave this property before nightfall. You will not return." "You can't fire me," Tucker said. "You need me. When they revolt, you'll need someone who isn't afraid to spill." "The only person who tried to spill blood today is you," Thaddeus said. "Hand me the gun, or Hawthorne rides to Sparta and tells the sheriff you pulled a weapon on your employer. Then we'll see whose version of discipline the law likes better." Tucker's jaw clenched. His hands shook, then steadied. For a moment Sarah saw the future in his eyes, saw his finger tightening, saw Thaddeus falling, saw herself reaching for the barrel too late. The moment passed. He spat on the ground, flipped the pistol around, and shoved it into Thaddeus's hand. "You'll be sorry," he said, "when this place burns, when that half-breed boy grows up thinking he owns men like me. You'll wish you'll let me shoot you now." "Perhaps," Thaddeus said. "Perhaps I'll wish I'd done many things differently, but I will never wish I had let cowardice decide my actions." Tucker rode away that afternoon, a small figure on a horse heading toward a world that had less use for him than he believed. Hawthorne watched him go, then turned back to the men in the field. "You heard what he said," he told them. "Some of it will be repeated in town, better or worse. but you also saw what happened when he pointed that gun. The master stood in front of you. Remember that. Later, when the sun had dropped and the air cooled, when Samuel's lip had been stitched with clumsy thread and his brother sat beside him, Sarah and Thaddeus stood on the veranda and looked out at the fields. I was afraid, she said quietly. So was I, he answered. It didn't stop us. It could have, she said. One twitch, one louder shout. We're building something that can be ruined in a heartbeat by a man whose pride is hurt. Yes, he exhaled. We are. She looked at him then, really looked, as if weighing whether he understood the cost of every day they stayed. Do you still think it is worth it? She asked. He thought of the barn full of fever, of the courtroom, of Thomas's small hand gripping his thumb with astonishing force. He thought of Della's careful dignity. He thought of Samuel's bloody mouth and the way the men had stood over him. Yes, he said, even if we lose everything, yes. Time is a strange thing on a plantation. Days repeat themselves with tiny variation spells. Fields, meals, ledgers and tilliers slide past unnoticed, and then there are days that take up more space in memory than all the others combined. The day Thomas was born was one of those. The labor began on a hot July morning in 1851. Thunder had stacked at the edge of the sky. It lasted 18 hours. Sarah had given orders as long as she could, which sheets to boil, which herbs to brew. At some point she stopped speaking. At some point she stopped being the woman who ran the ledgers, and became only a body trying to split itself in two. The midwife from Sparta, who had delivered half the county's children and had taken this job purely for the money, muttered that she did not attend this sort of mess. Then she saw the fee and the way Thaddeus's jaw clenched, and decided pride could wait. Just before dawn, with the air heavy and still, a child punched his way into the world and announced himself with a howl. He's healthy, the midwife said, more surprised than she should have been. Strong lungs, no marks. Thaddeus cut the cord with hands that shook. When he looked at his son's face, it was his own father's eyes he saw staring back, same gray, same pinch to the mouth. The baby's skin was light and even, the color of milky coffee. Guilt pricked him for feeling relief. Sarah watched his expression and understood without words. Their son, at a glance, could pass for the legitimate heir of any plantation in the county. His mother's heritage lived in his blood and bones, but not on his skin. We'll name him Thomas, she said later, when she had both her breath and her sense of humor back. Your father would enjoy the irony. Life after his birth was small and vast at once. Nights fractured into 2-hour stretches, punctuated by cries. Days filled with naps, feedings, and the constant low hum of worry that comes with something so fragile and so loud. The plantation did not pause to accommodate their new reality. Cotton still needed picking. Accounts still needed balancing. People still got sick and stubborn in equal measure. If the work had been too much for one person before, it was now far beyond what any man could carry alone. But he was no longer alone. They took shifts with the baby. They learned whose hands were better at coaxing gas, whose voice soothed faster. There were arguments, quick and stupid, and mended in apology, an hour later. There were moments when one of them would look up from a ledger and realize the other had already done the thing they had meant to ask for. Grief sat between them, too. They did not speak often of Catherine, but she was there, an invisible third figure in the house. A woman who had died carrying his first child, and who left behind a shape of what might have been. Sometimes, when Thomas slept with his mouth parted in a certain way, Thaddeus's chest hurt so sharply he had to leave the room. He told Sarah this once, haltingly. I see her in him, he said, or what she might have been, with a son who lived. It feels like a betrayal. It isn't, Sarah replied. Grief doesn't cancel love. It just takes up space beside it. She spoke as someone who had long since made room for too many things. In 1857, after a winter that refused to leave, Thaddeus caught a cough he could not shake. He insisted it was nothing. The doctor from Sparta came, listened to his chest, and left with a tight mouth. The cough settled deeper. There were nights when his ribs seemed to fight against his lungs. Sarah sat up with him, the way she had during the fever years before, but this time the sickness did not burn itself out. It hollowed him steadily, week by week. He put his affairs in order with the same thoroughness he had always brought to his books. The will he drafted was a fortress of clauses. It named Sarah as his lawful wife and sole heir. It named Thomas as her heir. It spelled out what should happen if any court tried to invalidate their marriage, how property should be disposed if violence forced them from the land, which workers were to receive manumission at once, and which were to be given wages and contracts that would make eventual freedom possible. "Do you think it will stand?" he asked Peyton, who stood at the window reading with narrowed eyes. "It's not elegant," Peyton said. "It's almost vindictive in its attention to loopholes. I like it. I'd still rather you didn't die yet." "So would I," Thaddeus said dryly. "We do not always get what we prefer." He died in February, at 46, on a night when frost crawled up the windows and the fields shone under a thin skin of ice. Sarah held his hand. Thomas slept in the next room, 9 years old, thin and long-legged, too smart for his own peace, in his last lucid hours. Thaddeus looked at his son and then at his wife. "Teach him," he whispered, "not just how to count, how to choose what to count." "I will," she said. Wycliffe did not stop breathing with him, neither did its enemies. But by then, the war that had been a murmur on the horizon had grown into something louder. In 1861, the state voted to secede. Boys marched to drums. Men made speeches about honor and rights, about protecting a way of life that was already cracking. For Sarah, the war was a storm she had been bracing for since the day she stepped onto the wagon off Webb's chain. It brought danger, yes, Confederate patrols, hungry soldiers looking for food, neighbors more willing than ever to call her unnatural. It also brought movement. Escaped men and women began to move through Georgia toward Union lines like water, seeking lower ground. Some passed through Wycliffe by design, some by accident. Sarah found herself sheltering them, feeding them, showing them in ledger-precise terms how many miles lay between them and relative safety. Thick webs of people-free blacks, white dissenters, Quakers, even the occasional Confederate deserter, sickened by what he had seen, began to string themselves across the South. Stories later called it the Underground Railroad, as if it had been a single thing. To Sarah, it was faces and nights and the scrape of boots in the dark. Thomas grew up amid this. By 12, he had memorized his father's maps of northern states. By 15, he was tall enough to pass as a white boy from somewhere else entirely, which made him useful in ways that frightened his mother. "You'll be careful," she would say, whenever he rode off with a wagon under some pretext. "Careful, not brave." "Yes, Mama," he would say. He was both. When Union troops finally swept through Hancock County in 1864, burning some plantations and leaving others, they found Wycliffe an oddity, a place where some black men owned their own plows, where a black woman in her 40s argued calmly with a colonel about what would and would not be requisitioned in the name of the army, across the line. The Crenshaw property went up in flames. Robert Crenshaw died of a stroke not long after, his fortune gone and his righteousness sour in his mouth. His widow moved to Savannah to live with cousins and complain about how the world had gone wrong. After the war, the word emancipation took on meaning. For some, it meant wandering. For some, it meant bitter disappointment when the promised 40 acres never appeared. For those on Wycliffe land, it meant a shift on paper, then a more gradual change in habit. Sarah did not become a saint in the stories told by the people who stayed. She became something more useful, a landowner who could be argued with, who could be bargained with, who did not always say yes, but who did not treat their needs as noise. By 1880, she was 63 and tired. Her hands ached in the mornings. The patches on her skin had spread along her jaw and hairline. Children in the yard sometimes stared, but they did not scream. They had grown up seeing her that way. To them, she was as ordinary and strange as any grandmother. She handed the plantation to Thomas then. He had his own plans. He ran it for 20 years, long enough to see Reconstruction falter and Jim Crow rise, long enough to discover that a free black man owning land in Georgia in that era was both miracle and constant threat. In 1900, he sold the property to a lumber interest. He took the money and moved north to Philadelphia, the city where his parents had married. There, he founded a school. It was not large. It did not have fancy brick buildings or an endowment that newspapers wrote about. It had a handful of rooms, a bell, and children whose grandparents had been property. It had books that once would have been locked away from them. It had ledgers that Thomas kept with the same care his parents had. He hung in his office an old, faded marriage certificate from a Quaker meeting house, the ink almost too pale to read. He did not explain it to everyone who came. He did not have to. Sarah followed him north a few years later, her body finally conceding that the Georgia heat no longer suited it. She lived in a small house with a patch of yard where she grew herbs and sat sewing while her grandchildren played at her feet in Philadelphia. Strangers stared at her marks as people had in Georgia, but with less open hostility and more awkward curiosity. Sometimes they asked. Sometimes, she answered. I was born like this, she would say, or near enough. It has never killed me. Other things have tried. She died in 1902, at 75, in a bed she owned, in a city where no man could sell her children. Her obituary in a local paper called her a businesswoman and educator, which made her laugh when someone read it aloud. Then it made her cry when she thought of the girl in Richmond who had been shut away like a bad painting. Back in Georgia, the ledgers from Wycliffe eventually worked their way into state archives. Clerks boxed them, labeled them, forgot them. Decades later, some historian opened one to the page from March 1851 and frowned at the note about the abominable one. Most accounts of the story that followed treated it as a curiosity, a planter who married a slave, a legal loophole, a woman with a strange skin condition, running a plantation like a northern factory. Interesting, yes. Footnote material. But in the quiet spaces, the stories told in kitchens, the whispered tales in church basements, the way a teacher in Philadelphia might hold up a faded certificate and tell her students that someone like them once stood up in a room full of people and asked to be seen as human, the tale of Wycliffe became something else. It became proof. Proof that even in a world built on ledger lines and chains, a man could look at someone he had been taught to own and instead see a partner. Proof that a woman who had been shut in a closet for ugly skin could stand in a courtroom and make men doubt the rightness of their own reflections. Proof that a system requiring people to be less than they are can be challenged, piece by piece, ledger by ledger, choice by choice. The horror at Wycliffe had never really been a woman's marked skin or a forbidden marriage. The horror was the system that made such things monstrous in the first place, that could look at a child born of love and ask first who owned him. What happened there did not topple that system. War, economics, stubbornness, and blood did that. But in one house, on a Georgia hill, years before the fire reached the whole forest, two people chose to live as if the rules were already changing. They paid for it in exile, in loneliness, in the constant ache of being stared at as if they were the ones misshapen instead of the world. They paid, and still, they did it. The ledgers remember.